Liesel Brenner was 21 years old, and she had served as a clerk for a small German army unit in France, handling documents and supply records. When her unit surrendered to the Americans, she expected to be kept somewhere in Europe. But within weeks, she and several dozen other women were told they would be sent overseas. None of them understood exactly where until they reached the port and saw the American ships waiting. The guards told them they were going to the United States. The news felt strange, almost impossible to believe, because America had always sounded like another world entirely, far away, rich and untouched by war. The crossing took almost 2 weeks. The sea was rough, and the prisoners slept in bunks stacked 3 high, guarded by soldiers who spoke little German but treated them with a kind of distant politeness. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible and untold stories from the history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's really fascinating to see how far these forgotten stories can reach. All right, they were given regular meals, bread, stew, fruit, and even chocolate, which already felt luxurious compared to what they had eaten in Germany. Liesel noticed that even the guards ate the same food, and that there was always enough. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hungry at night. When the ship finally reached the coast, the prisoners were put on trains that carried them deep into the country. Through the windows, Liesel saw wide fields, small towns, and roads lined with trees. Everything looked orderly and untouched by bombing. It was quiet in a way that Europe hadn't been for years. After several days of travel across the United States, the train carrying Liesel Brenner and the other German women finally slowed down near a small town surrounded by open land. Through the windows, Liesel saw wide fields, fences, and a few wooden buildings that looked newly built. The guards told them this was their destination. The women gathered their belongings, mostly small bags with clothes and letters, and stepped off the train into the warm afternoon air. The place felt strange. Not threatening, not welcoming, just quiet and organized. There were guards posted near the gates, but they did not shout or hurry the prisoners. Everything happened in an orderly, calm way. Trucks waited to take them from the station to the camp, which was a few miles away. As the trucks moved along the dirt road, Liesel noticed how clean everything looked compared to Europe. The farms were intact, the roads smooth, and there were no burned buildings or ruins anywhere. She felt a mix of relief and disbelief. It was hard to imagine that this country had been part of the same war that had destroyed so much of Germany. When the trucks reached the camp, the prisoners were told to line up for registration. American officers checked their names against a list and gave each woman a tag with her number. The process took time, but there was no shouting, no pushing, and no harsh treatment. Once the paperwork was done, they were taken to a row of wooden barracks that would serve as their living quarters. Each barrack had several rooms with iron beds, thin mattresses, and small wooden cabinets. It was basic, but everything was clean. The windows opened easily and the air smelled of dry wood and soap. The women were then shown the washroom. To Liesel, it was the most surprising part of the entire camp. There were sinks with running water, mirrors, and showers with proper drains and curtains. Hot water came out of the pipes almost immediately, something she had not experienced in years. In Germany, by the end of the war, even simple washing had become difficult. Soap was rare and water was often cold or rationed. Here, there was enough for everyone. After the inspection, each woman received new clothes, plain khaki uniforms marked with PW on the back. They were loose and practical, but freshly washed and folded. The guards explained the camp rules through an interpreter. Work assignments, meal times, mail schedules, and restrictions on movement. Everything had its place and time. Liesel realized that the structure made things easier. There was no confusion, no uncertainty, and everyone knew what to expect each day. That evening, the group was led to the dining hall. It was a large building with long wooden tables and benches lined up in rows. The smell of cooking drifted from the kitchen, and though none of the prisoners knew what kind of food was being prepared, it was warm and comforting. They had not eaten since morning, and hunger mixed with nervousness as they waited quietly for the signal to line up. Some whispered to each other, wondering what the Americans would serve, but most stayed silent, watching the guards and trying to understand the new routine. When the doors opened, the women filed in one group at a time. The American cook stood behind the serving line, wearing white aprons and handing out trays. Liesel held hers tightly, unsure if she was supposed to speak or stay silent. She had spent months expecting harsh treatment, but instead everything was calm, polite, and efficient. She noticed that even though they were prisoners, no one insulted or humiliated them. The guards stood at their posts watching but not interfering. The room was bright, the smell of food strong, and the sound of metal trays clattering filled the air. Liesel found a seat with a few other women from her unit. For the first time since leaving Europe, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She still did not know what life in this camp would truly be like. But in that moment, surrounded by order and quiet voices, she sensed that it would be different from what she had imagined on the ship. She didn't know yet that the meal she was about to eat would be one of the most memorable moments of her life. But she could already tell that this place, even behind fences, was nothing like the prisons she had feared. When the signal was given to begin dinner, the line of German women started to move slowly toward the serving counter. Liesel Brenner followed the others, holding her tray with both hands. The room was warm and filled with the steady sounds of movement, footsteps, trays sliding on metal, and the low hum of quiet conversation. The smell of cooked food drifted through the air, stronger now that they were closer to the kitchen. None of them had eaten much that day, and after the long journey and the registration process, their hunger was sharp but mixed with hesitation. They still didn't know what kind of food the Americans would give them or how they would be treated during mealtime. When Liesel reached the counter, an American cook wearing a white apron placed a large spoonful of mashed potatoes on her tray, followed by a slice of roast beef, cooked vegetables, and a piece of white bread with butter already spread on it. Then, without a word, he added a small portion of something she had not seen in years, a dessert, a piece of cake with frosting. She looked up, almost to make sure he had not made a mistake, but the man only nodded toward the end of the line. It was clear that this was the standard meal for everyone. The women carried their trays to the tables and sat down in groups of 6 or 7. At first, no one touched the food. They looked at each other, then at the guards standing by the door. One of the older women whispered that maybe they should wait for permission, but a guard noticed the hesitation and simply said, "Go ahead, eat." The tone was casual, not unkind. Slowly, one by one, they began to eat. Liesel cut a small piece of the meat and tasted it. It was soft, cooked evenly and warm all the way through. The potatoes were creamy and smooth, and the vegetables still had flavor, not overcooked, not watery. The bread was white, soft, and slightly sweet, something she hadn't tasted in years. She had grown up eating dark rye bread, heavy and coarse, but this bread seemed almost too light, as if it belonged to another time. When she took a bite of the cake, she felt a kind of surprise that was difficult to describe. The sweetness was unfamiliar after years of rationing, and she found herself eating slowly, trying to make it last. Around her, the same quiet disbelief spread through the room. Some of the women smiled, some laughed quietly, and some shook their heads as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. A few even wiped their eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange relief that came with feeling full and safe for the first time in a long while. The tension that had filled the room since they arrived began to fade, replaced by a steady calm. The guards watched without interfering. There were no shouted orders, no rush to finish, no punishment for speaking. It was a meal, nothing more, but for the prisoners it felt like something extraordinary. After they finished eating, the women were told to place their trays in a bin near the door. The process was quiet and organized. Liesel followed the others, returning her tray and stepping outside into the evening air. The sun had dropped low and the camp lights were turning on. She could hear faint music coming from one of the guard buildings, some kind of American song she didn't recognize. Walking back to her barrack, she felt full in a way she had not felt since before the war began. Her stomach was no longer tight with hunger, and her hands had stopped shaking. It was a simple thing, a meal served in a prison camp, but it carried more comfort than she could explain. She thought about the people back home in Germany, still struggling to find food, and the contrast made her uneasy. It didn't seem fair that she, a prisoner, was eating better than her own family. But she also knew there was nothing she could do about it. The only thing that made sense was to stay quiet, follow the rules, and be grateful that for once there was enough. That night, as she lay in her bunk, Liesel listened to the quiet sounds of the camp, footsteps outside, the wind against the windows and the faint hum of a generator somewhere in the distance. For the first time since leaving Europe, she did not fall asleep hungry. The day had been long and uncertain, but the food had left her feeling steady, almost calm. She didn't yet know what the next days would bring, but she understood one thing clearly. Life in this camp was not going to be what she had imagined when she first heard the word captivity. In the following days, the same pattern continued. Every meal arrived on time, always enough, always warm. The menus changed slightly, sometimes stew instead of roast, sometimes beans or cornbread or fruit from cans. Even coffee was served, and though it was weak, it was still coffee. The women began to look forward to mealtime as the one part of the day that reminded them of normal life. Conversations became more relaxed, and small bits of laughter returned to the tables. The guards noticed the change too. They began to speak a little more freely with the prisoners, sometimes making short comments about the food or joking about the portions. There was still a strict separation between the two sides, but the sense of hostility had faded. The Americans treated the women as people to be managed, not enemies to be punished. For Liesel, every meal reinforced a simple truth she hadn't expected to learn in captivity. That order, food, and routine could do more to calm fear than any speech or promise. She didn't think deeply about it or try to explain it. She simply lived it. Day after day, sitting at the same wooden table, holding the same metal tray, and eating the same food that continued to remind her that the war, at least for her, was truly over. As the days passed, life in the camp began to settle into a pattern that felt steady and predictable. Each morning, the women were woken up by a bell that rang from a small tower near the main gate. Liesel usually opened her eyes a few minutes before the sound because she had already learned to expect it. The barracks were quiet at first, filled only with the sound of feet moving on wooden floors and soft voices greeting one another. Everyone folded their blankets, straightened their beds, and made sure the room looked clean before the guards came by to inspect. Breakfast came soon after. It was served in the same dining hall where they had eaten their first meal. The food was simple but warm, usually scrambled eggs, bread, and coffee. Some mornings there was oatmeal or fruit from a tin, and once in a while the cook served something new like pancakes which none of the women had ever eaten before. At first they were shy about it, unsure how to eat something so soft and sweet in the morning, but it soon became a small highlight of the day. The food never tasted fancy, but it was consistent, and that regularity made it feel safe. After breakfast, the women were divided into small work groups. The American officers explained that the work was voluntary, but those who joined would receive small privileges, extra letters home, better shoes, or more time outside. Liesel signed up almost immediately. She was assigned to help in the kitchen, where she worked alongside both German and Italian prisoners under the supervision of American cooks. Her job was mostly cleaning and preparing vegetables, but she preferred it over sitting in the barracks all day. The kitchen was busy from morning to afternoon, and the routine never really changed. There were big metal pots boiling water, knives chopping onions, and trays stacked in neat rows. The work was tiring, but the atmosphere was calm. The Americans gave clear instructions and rarely raised their voices. Liesel noticed how organized everything was. The ingredients were measured carefully, the equipment cleaned after every use, and even waste was sorted neatly. It was a system that worked without confusion or chaos, and she quietly admired that. Over time, she began to talk more with the others in the kitchen. Most of them were young like her, and they shared bits of their stories while they worked. Some had been captured in France, others in North Africa, and a few from hospitals in Italy. They all carried the same uncertainty about their families back home. The Americans allowed them to send letters once a month, but replies came slowly and many went unanswered. The waiting made everyone restless, but the work helped distract them. By the second month, the guards began to recognize her by name. One of them, a tall man from Ohio, often greeted her when she carried supplies from the storage room. He didn't speak German, but he always said good morning with a friendly tone, and she learned to reply with a soft good morning of her own. It was a small exchange, but it meant more than either of them probably realized. In the camp, politeness felt like a piece of normal life that had survived the war. Evenings were the quietest part of the day. After dinner, the women were allowed to walk around the yard within the fence. Some wrote letters at the tables near the barracks. Others washed clothes or simply sat and talked. Liesel often joined a small group that gathered near the fence to watch the sunset. From there they could see the fields beyond the camp, long stretches of open land dotted with farmhouses and trees. The sight made her think of home, of the countryside outside Stuttgart, though she tried not to dwell on it for too long. Thinking about home only made the waiting harder. Inside the barracks, the women started to build small routines to make life feel less like imprisonment. They shared small items, hairbrushes, thread, and bits of fabric. One woman who had worked as a teacher before the war began giving English lessons using words she remembered from old school books. The Americans didn't mind as long as it kept the women busy. Liesel wasn't very good at learning new languages, but she liked listening to the lessons, mostly for the sound of laughter that sometimes filled the room when someone mispronounced a word. Working in the kitchen also brought her small advantages. Sometimes there were leftovers, and the cooks allowed the helpers to take small portions back to the barracks. A piece of fruit, a slice of bread, or a bit of jam became something to share quietly at night. These moments, though small, helped build a sense of community among the prisoners. They were no longer strangers forced together by war. They had become a kind of temporary family, connected by the same walls and routines. Weeks turned into months, and the fear that had followed Liesel since her capture slowly faded. She still missed her family and worried about what was happening in Germany, but she had learned how to live with uncertainty. The camp was not home, but it was stable, and that stability was something rare after years of chaos. Sometimes she thought about how strange it was to feel safer in a place surrounded by fences than she had in her own country during the last months of the war. But she didn't try to understand it too deeply. Life had narrowed down to simple things: meals, work, rest, and waiting. Each day passed quietly, and in that quiet she began to regain a sense of normal rhythm, something she thought she had lost forever. By early spring, the air around the camp began to change. It wasn't the weather, though the days were getting warmer. It was the way people spoke, the way they moved, and the quiet tension that ran through every conversation. For months, the women had lived in a routine that rarely shifted, but now small pieces of news began to filter in through the guards and Red Cross workers. The war in Europe, they said, was coming to an end. No one knew exactly when or how, but everyone could feel that something was about to change. Mail deliveries, which had always been slow and uncertain, suddenly became more frequent. The camp office posted lists of names whenever new letters arrived, and each time the list went up, the women rushed to read it. Most names weren't there, but a few lucky ones were called to the office to collect their envelopes. Liesel checked the lists every time, her heart tightening a little when she didn't see her name. It took weeks before she finally received one. The envelope was thin, creased, and stamped with a Red Cross mark. Inside was a single page written in her mother's careful handwriting. Her mother wrote that their town near Stuttgart had been heavily damaged by bombing, but that she and Liesel's younger brother were still alive. Food was scarce and people waited in long lines for bread that ran out before everyone was served. She didn't know what had happened to many relatives, but she ended the letter with one short line that stayed in Liesel's mind for days. "At least you are safe, even if far away." Liesel read the letter over and over until she knew every word by memory. It gave her relief and guilt at the same time. Relief, because her family had survived. Guilt, because she ate 3 full meals a day while they struggled to find enough. She didn't talk much about it, but she noticed that the other women felt the same. When letters came, they brought both comfort and pain. Some cried quietly, others stared at the paper without speaking. Those who received no mail at all seemed to grow quieter with each passing week. The Americans never shared official news with the prisoners, but information spread anyway. Some guards hinted that Berlin was surrounded. Others mentioned that the German army was collapsing. A few prisoners who worked near the offices overheard radio reports. The details were never clear, but the direction of the war was obvious. Every rumor carried both hope and fear. Hope that the fighting would stop. Fear of what the end might mean for the people back home. Liesel kept working in the kitchen, but the mood had changed there too. The American cooks seemed lighter, sometimes even cheerful, while the German helpers grew more withdrawn. No one said it openly, but everyone understood that Germany was losing. During breaks, women whispered about what would happen if the war truly ended. Would they be sent home immediately, or would they stay as prisoners until arrangements were made? No one knew, and the Americans didn't answer questions about it. One afternoon, near the end of April, an officer entered the kitchen carrying a newspaper. He handed it to one of the cooks, who read the headline and nodded slightly. The officer said something quickly in English, and though Liesel couldn't understand all the words, she caught one clearly: surrender. The sound of it made her stop working for a moment. She looked at the others, but no one spoke. The officer folded the newspaper and left the room. The Americans didn't celebrate loudly, but the difference in their mood was clear. The war in Europe was over, or almost over, and everything they had known up to that point was now part of the past. That evening, the guards didn't follow their usual schedule. The women were allowed to stay outside longer than usual, and though no one explained why, everyone knew the reason. Some prisoners stood near the fence and stared out at the horizon in silence. Others gathered in small groups, trying to understand what peace meant for them. Now, Liesel sat on a bench near the barracks, holding her mother's letter in her hands. She wanted to feel happiness that the war had ended, but she couldn't. The word peace felt too heavy, too complicated. For her, nothing had really changed yet. She was still behind a fence, still far from home, and still uncertain about what came next. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Some confirmed that Germany had surrendered. Others described the chaos that followed. Towns in ruins, soldiers returning home to nothing, families searching for one another. The women read these letters together, sharing bits of information and trying to imagine what their country looked like now. The idea of returning home no longer felt simple or even entirely hopeful. There was relief, but also fear of what they would find when they got there. Life in the camp continued much the same way for a while. The guards were more relaxed and the work went on as usual. But something had shifted permanently. The women no longer felt like prisoners of war waiting for orders. They were displaced people waiting for a world to rebuild itself. Every day felt longer, filled with a quiet kind of waiting that had no clear end. Liesel kept her letter folded neatly in her locker, reading it on quiet nights when the camp lights dimmed. It reminded her that somewhere beyond the fences, her family was still alive, and that eventually she would see them again. She didn't know when or how, but that small belief was enough to keep her steady through the uncertain months that followed. It took many months after the end of the war before Liesel and the other women were told they would finally be sent back to Germany. The camp staff didn't give them a specific date at first, only saying that arrangements were being made and that transportation would take time. Ships were limited, papers had to be approved, and many countries were still sorting out what to do with thousands of prisoners scattered across the world. The waiting felt endless. During those months, the daily routine continued almost exactly as before. The women still worked in the kitchen, cleaned their barracks, and lined up for roll call. The only difference was the tone of everything around them. The guards no longer seemed watchful in the same way. Some even spoke more openly, asking questions about Germany, about family, about home. A few prisoners were trusted with small jobs outside the fence, working in nearby fields or repairing buildings, always under supervision, but with far more freedom than before. Then, one morning in early autumn, a list was posted on the main board. It was longer than usual, and at the top were the words "Return Transport, Group 1. Liesel's name was on it. She read it twice to be sure, and when she turned around she saw other women reacting the same way, relief, excitement, and worry all mixed together. For months they had spoken about this moment, but when it finally came, it didn't feel entirely real. They didn't cheer or celebrate. They just stood quietly, reading their names again, trying to understand that their time behind the fences was truly ending. In the days that followed, they were given new clothes and told to pack the few belongings they had collected. Most of it fit into small cloth bags, letters, photographs, and bits of clothing they had mended over the months. The camp officers explained the route they would take, first by train to the East Coast, then by ship across the Atlantic, and finally through temporary processing stations in Europe before reaching Germany. No one knew what they would find when they arrived, but everyone knew it would not be the same country they had left. When the trucks came to take them away, the Americans lined up to check their names one last time. Some of the guards who had been in the camp for months shook hands with the prisoners or simply nodded goodbye. There was no ceremony, no music, just a quiet sense of ending. Liesl climbed into the back of one of the trucks and looked at the camp for the last time. The fences, the towers, and the dining hall, where everything had first seemed so strange. It had been a prison, but it had also been a place of safety and structure, and leaving it brought a strange mix of freedom and fear. The train ride to the coast took several days. The scenery outside the windows passed by in long stretches of open land, towns and rivers. Many of the women pressed their faces to the glass, taking in as much as they could. The America they had seen only through fences now seemed wider and calmer than they had imagined. They talked quietly among themselves about the food, the order, and the strange politeness of their captors. Liesl didn't say much, but she listened. She thought about the first meal she had eaten in the camp, the mashed potatoes, the roast beef, the soft bread, and how something as simple as a plate of food had changed the way she saw her enemies. At the port, the women were loaded onto a large ship along with hundreds of other returning prisoners. The American officers gave final instructions, checked the lists again, and wished them safe travel. When the ship pulled away from the dock, many of the women stood at the railing, watching the shoreline fade. Some cried, some stayed silent. Liesl didn't cry. She felt something deeper, a quiet heaviness that came from knowing she was leaving behind the only stable place she had known in years, heading toward a future she couldn't imagine. The journey across the Atlantic was long but calm. The women were given regular meals and kept in separate quarters from the male prisoners. They spent most of their time talking, reading old letters, or staring at the water. Every day felt slower than the one before. As they neared Europe, the conversations grew quieter. No one knew what they would find when they arrived. Families gone, homes destroyed, cities in ruins. Yet everyone wanted to see it with their own eyes, no matter how bad it might be. When the ship finally docked, the passengers were met by Allied officers and Red Cross workers. The air was cold, and the harbor was crowded with people returning from every direction. Liesl followed the group through checkpoints and processing tents, moving slowly through lines that seemed to go on forever. The officers gave them basic instructions, a small ration of food and papers that would allow them to travel to their home regions. After that, the group was dismissed. For the first time in years, Liesl stood outside a fence with no guard watching her. She didn't know where to go first, but she started walking toward the train station with a few others from her camp. The tracks would take her east, toward what was left of Stuttgart. She didn't know if her family was still there or if the house had survived, but she needed to find out. As the train moved through the ruined countryside, she saw the destruction for the first time. Towns flattened, bridges broken, smoke still rising from distant buildings. It was not the Germany she remembered. Yet despite the shock, she kept looking out the window, determined to see it all. The fences, the uniforms, the camp routines, all of it was behind her now. The war had ended, but rebuilding her life was only beginning. When she finally stepped off the train days later, the streets were quiet and nearly unrecognizable. Buildings she had known were gone, replaced by piles of stone. But somewhere beyond the rubble, she hoped her family was waiting. Holding her small bag close, she walked slowly toward what used to be her neighborhood, ready to face whatever she found there. When she finally stepped off the train days later, the streets were quiet and nearly unrecognizable. Buildings she had known were gone, replaced by piles of stone. But somewhere beyond the rubble, she hoped her family was waiting. Holding her small bag close, she walked slowly toward what used to be her neighborhood, ready to face whatever she found there. When Liesl finally reached the outskirts of her hometown, she hardly recognized it. The train station was still standing, but much of the area around it was blackened and broken. Streets she had known since childhood were buried under piles of bricks. People walked slowly through the debris, carrying buckets, shovels, and small bundles of belongings. No one moved quickly and no one spoke loudly. The war had ended, but its shadow still hung over everything. She followed what was left of the main road toward the neighborhood where her family had lived. The houses were half destroyed, their roofs missing, their walls scorched. She passed a group of children digging through rubble for bits of wood, and an old man sitting on a doorstep staring at a cracked photograph. Every few steps she stopped to look around, trying to see something familiar. It was difficult to tell where one house ended and another began. When she reached the spot where her home had once stood, she saw only the remains of the foundation and part of a wall still upright. The sight made her stand still for a long time. She didn't cry, but she felt the air leave her lungs. There was a small garden behind the ruins, overgrown and scattered with stones, but the fence her father had built years ago was still there, bent but recognizable. For a moment, that small detail was enough to keep her standing. A neighbor appeared from a nearby building, a woman she remembered faintly from before the war. The woman recognized her immediately and hurried over. She told Liesel that her mother and brother had survived and were living in a temporary shelter on the other side of town. They had been forced to move after a bombing, but they were alive. The words came quickly, and before Liesel could even respond, she found herself walking again, this time with a clear direction. The shelter was a converted school building, crowded and noisy. Families shared classrooms and every hallway smelled of smoke and soup. When Liesel entered, she saw her mother sitting on a wooden bench near the wall. For a moment they both just looked at each other, unable to move. Then her mother stood and the two of them finally embraced. Her younger brother came running a moment later, his face thin but bright with recognition. They didn't speak right away because there was too much to say and too little space to fit it all. In the days that followed, Liesel learned what had happened during the years she'd been gone. Her father had died during an air raid, and her mother had worked in a factory until it closed. Food was still rationed, but at least there were distribution points, and aid was beginning to arrive from the Allies. Everything was about rebuilding. One wall, one road, one life at a time. Liesel didn't tell many stories about the camp. When people asked where she had been, she simply said, "In America." Some neighbors looked surprised, others suspicious, but she didn't explain further. How could she describe the strange safety of that place? The regular meals, the clean beds, the guards who treated her better than her own government had in the final months of the war. It was easier not to explain at all. She spent her days helping her mother gather supplies and cleaning what was left of their old house. Each morning she joined other townspeople clearing rubble from the streets. Everyone worked quietly side by side. There was no anger left, only exhaustion and the slow, heavy work of rebuilding. At night, when the lights went out early to save power, Liesel sometimes thought back to the camp's dining hall, the smell of bread and the order that had kept her life steady. It wasn't nostalgia, just memory. The war had taken away too much to leave space for longing. But she understood something simple now, that survival didn't always come from victory or pride, but from structure, food, and the small routines that kept people moving forward when everything else was gone. The weeks turned into months, and the ruins around her slowly changed shape. New roofs appeared. Shops reopened. People began talking about the future again. Liesel didn't know what that future would bring, but she had learned how to live one day at a time. The fences of the camp were gone, but the lessons she had carried from behind them stayed with her, quiet, steady, and unspoken. In 1943, every day hundreds of American bombers and fighters took off from England to strike targets deep inside German-occupied territory. The missions were long, the skies were hostile, and many pilots never made it home. The war in the skies over Europe had become one of the most dangerous parts of World War II. Among those young airmen was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a 22-year-old pilot from Oklahoma. Johnson had joined the U.S. Army Air Forces full of confidence, but soon learned how deadly aerial combat could be. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible and untold stories from the history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. It's really fascinating to see how far these forgotten stories can reach. All right. By mid-1943, he was flying with the 56th Fighter Group, one of the first American units to operate the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, heavily armored fighter plane known for its power and toughness. The Thunderbolt was not the fastest or most agile aircraft in the sky, but it had one unmatched advantage: it could take tremendous punishment and still fly. Pilots trusted it to bring them home even after the worst fights. Johnson admired the plane's strength, often saying it gave him a sense of safety in a sky filled with danger. That sense of safety would be put to the ultimate test on a June day in 1943, when Robert Johnson faced a mission that would push both man and machine beyond their limits. On the morning of June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Johnson climbed into his P-47 Thunderbolt at an airfield in southeastern England. His unit, the 61st Fighter Squadron, was assigned to escort American B-17 bombers on a mission deep into northern France. Their job was to protect the bombers from German fighter attacks and make sure the formation reached its target safely. The crew moved quickly through their final checks. The engines thundered to life, and soon the airfield was shaking with the deep rumble of dozens of Thunderbolts taking off one after another. Johnson's aircraft, marked Lucky 13, lifted into the sky and joined the formation heading across the English Channel. At first, everything seemed routine. The weather was clear and the bombers flew in tight groups as they crossed into enemy territory. From his cockpit, Johnson could see the silver wings of the flying fortresses glittering in the sunlight. He scanned the sky constantly, knowing that at any moment, German fighters could appear. Over northern France, the calm ended. Radar stations had already warned the Luftwaffe, and enemy pilots scrambled to intercept the American formation. Soon, black puffs of anti-aircraft fire filled the sky as the bombers began their bombing run. The Thunderbolts broke formation to engage a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving in from above. The air battle that followed was chaotic. Planes spun and rolled in every direction. The radio was alive with voices shouting warnings and calls for help. Johnson locked onto a German fighter and opened fire, watching his bullets tear through its wing. But seconds later, he felt a violent impact. His own aircraft had been hit. Enemy rounds ripped through his Thunderbolt's fuselage, shattering glass and tearing metal apart. Oil sprayed across the canopy, coating it in a thick black film that blinded him. The smell of smoke and fuel filled the cockpit. Johnson's controls felt heavy and unresponsive. He tried to pull up, but the stick barely moved. His wingman called out over the radio, but Johnson couldn't answer. The static was loud, and the intercom was dead. For a moment, he thought the fight was over, that he would have to bail out over enemy territory. But when he tried to open the canopy, it jammed. The handle wouldn't budge. He was trapped inside a crippled plane, still flying, but only just. Then, as the dogfight spread out and the bombers pushed on, Johnson realized he was alone. The rest of his squadron had disappeared into the clouds. He was deep over France, with a damaged aircraft, a wounded face, and no way to escape. And soon the situation would get even worse. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was now alone in the sky, flying a damaged P-47 Thunderbolt over occupied France. Before he could make any progress, a group of German fighters appeared. They were Focke-Wulf 190s, fast and dangerous aircraft flown by experienced pilots. Within seconds, they noticed Johnson's wounded Thunderbolt limping through the air, and they moved in to finish the job. What followed was one of the most unequal fights in aviation history. One American pilot against nearly 30 enemy fighters. The German aircraft attacked in pairs, diving down, firing and pulling away. Each pass sent a burst of gunfire tearing into Johnson's plane. Bullets struck the wings, ripped through the tail, and shattered more of the cockpit glass. Johnson could feel the entire airframe shaking with every hit, and he expected the next round to end it all. But the P-47, built with thick armor and a powerful radial engine, absorbed the punishment in a way no other fighter could. Johnson tried to fire back, but most of his guns had jammed during the earlier hit. He managed to clear one side and fired short bursts whenever an enemy came into view. But the damage to his canopy made aiming almost impossible. At times, he could barely tell where the Germans were attacking from. He focused only on keeping the Thunderbolt in the air, adjusting the trim and throttle with whatever limited control he had left. The attacks continued for what felt like an eternity. The German pilots seemed determined to destroy him, making pass after pass, circling back each time in disbelief that the American fighter still had not gone down. Johnson could see tracers flying past his wings, and he could hear bullets striking metal only a few feet from his seat. Smoke filled the cockpit, and his hands were slippery from oil and blood. Yet somehow the Thunderbolt continued to fly straight. One of the German pilots, perhaps the leader of the group, grew frustrated and decided to finish the fight himself. He came in close behind Johnson's plane, fired several long bursts, and then pulled up alongside to see the result. Through the cracked canopy, Johnson could see the pilot's face for a brief moment. The German raised his hand, gave a slow, almost respectful salute, and then turned away. The rest of the enemy fighters followed, leaving Johnson alone once more in the damaged Thunderbolt. For the first time in nearly half an hour, the sky around him was quiet. The guns were silent, and only the deep hum of the crippled engine remained. Against all odds, both man and machine had survived an encounter that should have ended in flames. But Johnson was still deep over enemy territory, and the long, dangerous flight home was just beginning. When the German fighters finally disappeared, Lieutenant Robert Johnson found himself alone again, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt that was barely holding together. The engine continued to run, but it sounded rough, and the entire airframe shook with every gust of wind. The control cables were damaged, and the elevator and rudder barely responded when he tried to adjust them. His face and hands were bleeding from small wounds caused by flying fragments of glass and metal. Despite the pain, his focus remained fixed on one goal: getting back to England. Johnson knew that bailing out was not an option. The canopy was jammed shut, and even if he could open it, parachuting into occupied France meant almost certain capture. His only chance was to keep the plane in the air long enough to cross the English Channel. He checked his instruments, but most of them were useless. The oil that had sprayed across the cockpit earlier now covered nearly everything, and visibility was still poor. Flying almost blind, he began to guide the damaged Thunderbolt north, using the sun and the landscape below to find his direction. The flight was long and tense. Every minute, Johnson expected the engine to seize or a control surface to fail completely. He kept his movements slow and steady, avoiding any sharp turns that could tear what was left of the structure apart. Occasionally, he saw bursts of flak in the distance, but by some luck, none came close enough to threaten him. At times, he could hear the wind whistling through bullet holes in the fuselage, reminding him how close he had come to death. As the minutes passed, the coastline appeared on the horizon. The sight of the English Channel gave him a small sense of relief, but he knew he was not safe yet. Crossing the open water in a damaged aircraft was risky. If the engine quit now, he would have no chance of surviving a ditching. Johnson kept the throttle as low as he dared, balancing power and engine temperature, listening carefully for any change in sound. The P-47 continued to fly, wounded but still strong, slowly carrying him home. When he finally spotted the white cliffs of Dover through the dirty canopy, the feeling was overwhelming. He called weakly over the radio to announce his return. Though the signal was faint, ground control guided him toward a nearby airfield, and he prepared for the landing. His landing gear indicators were unreliable, but he managed to lower the wheels by hand. As the Thunderbolt touched down, the damaged gear collapsed, and the aircraft slid across the runway before coming to a stop in a cloud of dust and smoke. Ground crews rushed to the wrecked plane, expecting to find a severely injured pilot, or worse. Instead, they saw Johnson climb out, shaken and exhausted but alive. When they inspected the Thunderbolt, they were stunned by the damage. More than 200 bullet holes covered the aircraft. The canopy was shattered, the tail section was torn apart, and several critical control cables were almost completely severed. Yet the engine had kept running, and the wings had held firm. The plane that should not have been able to fly had carried its pilot all the way home. When word spread about Lieutenant Robert Johnson's incredible survival, pilots across the airfields of England found it difficult to believe at first. Stories of damaged planes making it back from combat were not uncommon, but what Johnson had endured went far beyond anything most had ever heard. Mechanics and officers crowded around the battered Thunderbolt, examining the holes and torn metal with disbelief. They counted over 200 bullet impacts, several large cannon shell strikes, and damage to nearly every major surface of the aircraft. The wings were shredded, the tail was almost destroyed, and the cockpit looked as if it had been hit by a storm of shrapnel. Yet the engine had never completely failed, and the airframe had remained strong enough to stay together during the long flight home. The inspection confirmed what Johnson already knew during the battle, that the P-47 Thunderbolt was unlike any other fighter in the war. It was heavier than most aircraft of its class, powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, and protected by thick armor plating around the cockpit and fuel tanks. While many pilots had complained that the Thunderbolt was slower to climb and less agile than the German fighters, Johnson's experience proved that its toughness could make the difference between life and death. The plane's ability to take punishment and still fly became legendary almost overnight. Johnson himself became a symbol of courage and endurance within the 56th Fighter Group. His fellow pilots respected him not only for surviving the fight, but also for keeping his composure under impossible conditions. He had faced almost 30 enemy fighters alone, fought as long as he could, and refused to give up even when escape seemed impossible. His story quickly circulated through Allied bases, and soon newspapers in the United States began reporting on what came to be known as the Thunderbolt miracle. The Army Air Forces used Johnson's story as an example of both pilot skill and American engineering. They photographed the damaged plane and studied it carefully to understand how it had survived so much damage. The results confirmed that the P-47's armor layout and design made it one of the most durable fighters ever built. Engineers noted that the radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engines used by German aircraft, could take multiple hits without losing all power. This discovery reinforced confidence among pilots who would later fly deep escort missions over Germany. For Johnson, the event changed his reputation almost overnight. Before the mission, he was considered a capable but relatively new combat pilot with only a few victories to his name. Afterward, he was seen as one of the luckiest and toughest men in the air. He returned to flying missions soon after his recovery, continuing to escort bombers and engage German fighters. Over the next year, he steadily increased his victory count, proving that his earlier survival had not been luck alone. By the end of 1944, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson had become one of the top American aces in the European theater, officially credited with 27 aerial victories. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Air Medal for his actions. Despite his growing fame, he remained humble, often crediting his survival to the strength of the Thunderbolt rather than his own skill. He would later say that on that day in June, the aeroplane saved my life. The story also strengthened the morale of Allied airmen during one of the most difficult phases of the air campaign. It reminded pilots that even when they faced overwhelming odds, courage and determination could make the impossible possible. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once considered too heavy and sluggish by some critics, now had a reputation as a plane that could bring its pilot home under almost any circumstance. Its nickname, the Jug, became a badge of honor among those who flew it. As time passed, Johnson's encounter became one of the most frequently retold stories of aerial combat in World War II. Historians and aviation enthusiasts have studied it for decades, analyzing how the engagement unfolded and how the Thunderbolt managed to survive such severe damage. The event remains one of the clearest demonstrations of how the design of a machine and the determination of a human being can combine to overcome impossible odds. For the men who flew the Thunderbolt afterward, Johnson's name became a part of the aircraft's identity. Every pilot who climbed into a P-47 knew the story and drew strength from it. They believed that if the Jug could carry Robert Johnson through half an hour of attacks from nearly 30 German fighters, it could carry them home too. The story spread beyond the airfields and became part of the broader legend of American air power during the war, a symbol of endurance, resilience, and faith in the machines that carried them through the skies. Even after the war ended, the story of Robert Johnson and his Thunderbolt continued to be told. It appeared in military reports, history books, and documentaries, often described as one of the most remarkable survivals in aviation history. Johnson himself returned home, leaving the Air Force with honor, and lived a quiet life away from fame. Yet wherever the history of World War II aviation is discussed, his name remains associated with one of the most extraordinary aerial battles ever recorded, a lone pilot, a battered Thunderbolt, and a moment when endurance turned survival into legend. After the battle, Johnson's superiors ordered a full inspection of the wrecked aircraft to understand how it had managed to return. Engineers and intelligence officers studied every inch of the P-47, taking notes and photographs for reports that would later be circulated across the U.S. Army Air Forces. The findings surprised even the designers of the aircraft. They discovered that several control cables had been almost completely severed, held together by only a few thin strands of wire. The fuel tanks, though hit by multiple rounds, had not exploded thanks to a new self-sealing system. The engine, despite suffering major damage, had continued to produce enough power to keep the aircraft airborne for more than an hour. These discoveries confirmed the Thunderbolt's reputation for durability. Reports from other pilots who had been flying P-47s already suggested it could take heavy punishment, but Johnson's experience provided undeniable proof. His survival became a teaching tool in training programs for new pilots. In lectures and briefings, instructors used photographs of his aircraft to demonstrate why maintaining control and staying calm during combat could make the difference between life and death. Military leaders also recognized the value of morale at a time when bomber losses were high and fighter escort missions were increasingly dangerous. Johnson's story reminded air crews that their machines were reliable and that their efforts mattered. For weeks, news of his return was circulated across bases in England and back home in the United States. Articles in newspapers described him as the pilot who refused to die and the man who brought back a flying wreck. Johnson was soon recommended for several medals. In the official citation for his Distinguished Service Cross, his commanding officer praised his courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The award ceremony was held at his airfield, attended by fellow pilots who had seen firsthand how dangerous the skies over Europe had become. For many of them, seeing Johnson alive and standing in front of a bullet-riddled Thunderbolt was an unforgettable moment that gave them renewed confidence in their own missions. Although his survival had made him famous, Johnson continued to fly combat missions. The war did not slow down, and the need for experienced pilots was greater than ever. He returned to the air only weeks after his near-fatal encounter, once again escorting bombers over occupied Europe. Each mission carried new risks, but Johnson remained calm and methodical, relying on discipline and teamwork rather than luck. His skills improved with every flight, and he quickly became one of the most respected pilots in the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. The unit was known for its aggressive tactics and for producing some of the highest-scoring American aces of the war. Johnson's confidence in the Thunderbolt grew even stronger, and he often shared his experiences with new pilots, encouraging them not to panic when hit and to trust the aircraft's strength. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, Johnson's combat record expanded steadily. He achieved multiple confirmed victories against German fighters, sometimes downing several aircraft in a single mission. His calm attitude under fire made him a reliable formation leader, and his ability to keep focus even during chaotic battles became a model for others. By the time he was rotated back to the United States for rest and reassignment, Johnson had accumulated 27 confirmed kills, making him one of America's top-scoring aces in the European theater. His reputation extended beyond his unit, and his name was often mentioned alongside other legendary pilots of the war. He had survived the most impossible situation imaginable, and he continued to fight with the same level of courage that had saved his life on that day in June 1943. After the war, the story of Robert Johnson became closely tied to the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt itself. Historians, engineers, and veterans looked back at the aircraft as a symbol of American industrial strength and design ingenuity. Built in large numbers by the Republic Aviation Corporation, the Thunderbolt was not sleek or elegant, but it was practical, durable, and effective. It could escort bombers, dive-bomb ground targets, and absorb punishment that would destroy almost any other aircraft. Johnson's battle against the 28 enemy fighters became a central part of the Thunderbolt's reputation. When the aircraft was displayed at air shows or museums, guides often told visitors the story of how one pilot had flown home in a machine that looked like it had been torn apart by a storm of metal. His story was included in books, training manuals, and military histories, cited as an example of why design and reliability were as important as speed or maneuverability in wartime aviation. In the years that followed, Johnson's account continued to inspire new generations of pilots and engineers. The Thunderbolt remained in service long after the war ended, used by several countries around the world, and its reputation for toughness followed it everywhere. Even when jet aircraft replaced propeller-driven fighters, the lessons learned from the P-47's design influenced the next generation of American combat aircraft. When the war ended, Robert S. Johnson returned home as a decorated hero. Despite the recognition he received, he preferred a quiet life and rarely sought attention. Like many veterans, he carried memories of the war that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He later worked in the aviation industry, contributing to programs that continued to advance American air power. Johnson occasionally attended reunions and spoke at veteran events where he shared his experiences not as tales of glory but as lessons in perseverance and duty. He always emphasized that survival in combat depended as much on preparation, training, and teamwork as on courage. In interviews, he often credited the engineers who had built the Thunderbolt and the ground crews who maintained it every day. He considered them equally responsible for his survival. He passed away in 1998, leaving behind a legacy that still resonates among historians and aviation enthusiasts. His story continues to be featured in documentaries, museums, and books that explore the human side of air combat. To this day, when people talk about the extraordinary durability of the P-47, Johnson's name is almost always mentioned. The story of Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson and his P-47 Thunderbolt remains one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of aerial warfare. It demonstrates how the combination of human courage, technical innovation, and sheer determination can defy impossible odds. Johnson's survival was not just a matter of luck. It was the result of discipline, calm judgment, and a machine that was engineered for resilience. His experience changed how both pilots and engineers viewed air combat. It reinforced the idea that toughness and endurance were as essential as speed and power. More importantly, it became a symbol of hope during a time of war, when thousands of young men faced the constant threat of death in the skies over Europe. 80 years later, the Thunderbolt miracle continues to stand as a reminder of what human beings can endure when faced with overwhelming adversity. It tells the story of one pilot, one aircraft, and one extraordinary moment in history when survival itself became a victory.